Good evening. I wonder how the volume is. It feels a little bit low. Is it okay for you guys, or is it okay? Maybe just, so maybe I should say welcome to the end of daylight savings too, right? Like this shift that we do every year is, you would think we would get used to it year after year, but right? I don't know, I never get used to it. So tonight I'd like to start by reading a short poem by Maddie Weingast. And Maddie read some of the poems that were written by, in fact, it's the earliest human literature by women, attributed by women. And it's in the Buddhist tradition, in this tradition. And he read some of those poems and was inspired by them and kind of wrote some of his own poems based on some of the earlier ones. Those of you who are interested, the original poems are called the Therigatha. You can find versions of it on the website. And Maddie Weingast's inspirational poems is from the book First Free Women. So here's one of the poems that he writes. Maybe I should say a little bit more about what these poems are about. They are awakening poems, so things that the women, after like an awakening experience, they would write a poem or say, they probably at that time didn't write them, but would say a poem. So it's a kind of an exclamation after awakening. Some of it like how they got there or what the experience was like or something like this. So, and the poems are just named after the nun, the woman who said them. So this one, her name was Vijaya. When everyone else was meditating, I'd be outside the hall. Wait, I'm sorry. When everyone else was meditating, I'd be outside circling the hall. Finally, I went to confess. I'm hopeless, I said. The elder nun smiled. Just keep going, she said. Nothing stays in orbit forever. If this circling is all you have, why not make this circling your home? I did as she told me and went on circling the hall. If you find yourself partly in and partly out, if you find yourself drawn to this path and also drawing away, I can assure you, you're in good company. Just keep going. Sometimes the most direct path isn't a straight line. I love this poem. It's very sweet, right? She's kind of like circling around the hall, like, okay, I really should get in there. I really should settle down and meditate, but I'll do it later. Okay, but maybe I'll do this. I'll distract myself. I'll take care of this. I'll clean the refrigerator. Or I'll, all these types of things that we do, right? When we think we should be meditating or whatever it is, exercise, read more, eat better, all these things, right? We often are doing something else. But what I love about this poem, is it kind of points to the humanity of this, that we all have these ideas of what we should be doing or want to be doing, and then there's what we actually do. And then there's this nun, the elder nun who gives the instructions. If that's what you're doing, just keep doing it. And this way that this practice, this Buddhist practice, isn't asking us to be somebody that we're not. It's not asking us to completely change ourselves and pretend to be something or somebody that we're not. Instead, we start where we are. Of course we do. Of course we start where we are. And for many of us, probably more often than we like to admit, right? We're the ones that are kind of like circling the hall, quote unquote, instead of like actually getting to the cushion or doing the things that we think that we should be doing, want to be doing. So I know certainly for me, there have been times when I was just like circling the hall, this expression. that I just couldn't get myself to like meditate. Even though I had lots of experience meditating and had, lots of benefits from it, and I just couldn't do it. I just could not find myself getting to the cushion. And it wasn't immediately apparent to me why that was until a little bit later I realized that like I would sit down on the cushion and then, 90 seconds later, hop up, oh no, I need to take care of this, I got to do that, or something like this. And I didn't quite recognize that I was distracting myself because there was some uncomfortable emotions that would arise when I finally would stop circling and just settle down. I hadn't appreciated the impact that these difficult emotions were having on me. I couldn't even tell you exactly what it was, but whatever it was, I just felt like I did not want to experience it. Just this, oh my gosh, and would distract myself or busy myself or something like this. So in the Buddhist teachings, there aren't a lot of distinct teachings about emotions, specifically like how to be with difficult emotions or lovely emotions or things like this. And we might understand this in a few ways. One is that maybe in ancient India they had a different understanding about emotions. I know we might think that, well, emotions are emotions, what is there to understand? But I know that researchers, like when they want to look into emotions, they often will like have surveys, questionnaires that they ask people to do to kind of learn about people's inner life or what's happening. And what they've discovered is that they cannot translate these questionnaires from English into many other languages, because other languages don't even understand emotions the same way. For example, like in a question like, well, when is the intensity of that emotion the greatest? Some cultures don't even have this idea. What do you mean intensity of an emotion? That just doesn't make sense. We don't think of emotion as having intensity, or they would think about it, well, it's only what's expressed, it's not what's inside, or I don't know exactly how it would be, but this was turned out to be a whole area of research on its own, how different cultures have complete different understanding of what is an emotion, as well as the value of emotions. So we might understand that's why in ancient India there just wasn't the understanding that we have these thousands of years later, after how many, all this psychotherapy and all these types of things now, right? We shouldn't underestimate how much that's impacted our culture in terms of how we understand what it means to be a human and what it means to be a happy human. And I was thinking about this, so, how are emotions talked about? And it occurred to me that I can't even think exactly what the Pali word would be for emotion. Pali word is the language the scriptures are written in for this tradition, and I can't even think of one. But of course, we know about loving kindness practices, which are kind of like heart practices, loving kindness and compassion. We have things like generosity, which we might think can be an action, but also maybe it's just like an openness of the heart. So we have things like this, but there isn't emphasis on emotions and how they might be a part of our path of practice. But what is clear, I would say, in maybe contemporary times, is maybe that's not the number one practice we talk about in terms of finding greater freedom, finding awakening, finding peace. But it might be, I don't know if there's been any research on this, but it might be one of the biggest sticking points where people might get stuck or tangled up or have a lot of difficulties is with their emotions. just like for me, like I just couldn't meditate because I was trying to avoid my emotions, but I didn't even know I was trying to avoid them. It took me a while to kind of figure out and discover what was happening. So sometimes as we start this practice with the mindfulness practice, we just start to become more and more aware of our inner life, and or we aren't distracting ourselves as much, just paying attention more to our life in all areas of our life. And when we do that, there might be some new emotions that arise, or there might be some recognition, some uncomfortable realizations of psychological insights, etc. And so, even if we aren't aware of them, I would say, their influence, show up in so many different ways. And the last time I gave a Dharma talk, not last week, but the week before, I talked also about emotions and introduced a practice that Gil Fronsdal and Tanya Weiser have talked about, which I find really helpful, and I find myself offering it to a number of people as a way to support their practice. And this is the RAFT. Some of you have heard me say this. Recognize the emotion. Allow it to be there. It is there, so just allow it to be there. Feel it in the body. And then tease apart the emotion and our reaction to that emotion. RAFT. So we happily give these instructions. RAFT, you can do this with the emotions. But I want to unpack this just a little bit more, because this idea of to recognize, the first letter in RAFT, turns out to not be so simple. Because also with some like this emotional research, when they ask people, list your emotions or list emotions, most people had a list of 3. Sad, happy, and angry. Okay, but there's many more emotions. But most people just, in different cultures and Western cultures, non-Western cultures, had just these 3. But they didn't include things like contentment or despair or embarrassment or hopeful or overwhelm or awe. There's a really long list. But it turns out that people don't have this vocabulary for their emotional life. But it's not that they don't feel these things, but they can't explain it, or they can't share it, or aren't really in touch with it, or something like this. And in some ways this can be frustrating, because language, if we have language, if we're able to use word like awe or boredom or contentment, whatever it might be, ashamed, there's really long lists. If we don't have words, then it's about this, it's more difficult to not only connect with ourselves, with our experience, but to connect with other people. Kind of share what's going on with ourselves, to describe what's going on, or be able to relate to people, because a way that we connect with others, and connection is important, is through kind of this vulnerability and intimacy through our emotional life. But language also helps us to see connections between people, us and other people, ourselves and others, or connections between, this person had that expression on their face when they were talking about awe, but when I experience awe, it's different. And maybe we just start to understand ourselves better and understand the emotions better if we do have some of this language. So I've been saying just do RAFT, recognize, and not recognizing that Actually, this for myself too has been part of kind of my path, is to just kind of understand the whole range of emotions as opposed to just happy, sad, and angry. And so one thing that might be helpful or supportive is to broaden our emotional awareness or literacy. And one way we can do that is just to frequently throughout the day just check in, how am I feeling? And it can be helpful to have these lists of these words. And there's these lists, I've seen them all over the place. I've seen them in Dharma books, websites, these just kind of lists. So this could be something to help us this recognize. But then this idea of about allowing emotions, like maybe it's helpful to recognize, maybe I could use that word, that or to keep in mind that there is no emotion that is fundamentally wrong. There just isn't. We have emotions. That's not the same as behaviors and acting out. I'm talking about just the emotion, this rage or lust, or these types of things, right? They arise, and there isn't any of them that's fundamentally wrong. It's just what we do with them and how we get expressed. Because so we might say if an emotion is felt or experienced, it doesn't have to be different at that moment. We can just allow it to be there. We might not know why this emotion has arisen, how long it's going to be here. We don't know if there's a lesson connected to it, something that it needs to tell us, or we might, as I said, not even know precisely which emotion we're experiencing. But what we do know, that our emotional life is legitimate, it's valid, it's a rich part of the human experience, and it has, we might say, has a right to be a part of our experience. So what we don't know, why it's here or exactly, or a lot of things that we don't know about emotions. But what we do know, that it does have a right to be here. And this knowing, it's okay, it's what's arising, if we applied that sincerely and consistently to our life, this leads to a certain kind of peace. It leads to a diminishment, a softening of the struggling with our emotions, with our resistance to our emotions, to our mistrust of our emotions. And this peace, by just recognizing, okay, this is here, and I'm going to allow it to be here. It's legitimate because it actually is here. It's not like pretending that it's not there or trying to resist it is going to change the reality of it having arisen. Even though we might think that sometimes, right? We kind of might think this, but as our resistance softens, as our allowing increases, this peace increases in our life. This freedom increases in our life. But why is it so hard to allow emotions if they're just this natural thing that humans have, however they understand emotions? Why is it so hard? Why do we have to have a whole practice around it? Well, I think for many of us, we have a mistrust of emotions and maybe a misunderstanding. And in some ways, this kind of seems so common. And I know I certainly have had a lot of mistrust of emotions. Certainly in my younger life, I just thought they were messy and I don't know, I just thought that they got in the way and life would be so much better without them, right? Teenage years, young adulthood, I couldn't find my way, really confused and just out of sorts. And so I felt like, okay, just things would be better if they didn't have emotions. And I don't know, I can imagine now, I wasn't aware of it then, but maybe that was part of why I became a research scientist, right? Because, science is all neat and tidy, and I love kind of mathematics with the tidiness of that. And so maybe that's partly what led me to in that field. And clearly I didn't stay there, but but there was something that when I had kind of early in my Buddhist practice years, I was doing some training to be a chaplain in the hospitals, an interfaith chaplain. And as part of the training, we read this book called Wounded Healer by Henry Nguyen. I don't remember all the details of this book. This was quite some time ago, but just even this idea, wounded healer, Henry Nguyen's point is that all the difficulties that we have helps us to connect with others, helps us to understand others. They are actually just, it's okay, it's a part of our life. And that book in particular was about how to be a minister or a chaplain to support people. This idea that, people are suffering and you can connect with them through your own suffering and from what you've learned from it. And that was a game changer for me to read this book. It never occurred to me. Oh, all the difficulties I had when I was younger actually could be helpful. And I have found this to be true. In my role as a dharma teacher and a retreat teacher, sometimes in retreats, our difficulties arise. And people meet with me and I can hear and feel and see their difficulties. And I feel like, I've been there too. And that's really different than just giving a clinical explanation or something like this. So this was a big surprise for me, that what I felt like needed to be avoided turned out to be a strength in some ways. I don't want to say that I'm perfect with emotions or anything like this, and that I can perfectly match everybody that comes to talk to me. I don't want to give that impression. But just this idea that our emotional life, even if it sometimes is a difficult emotional life, has value and might even really support us for ourselves or for other loved ones or people in our lives. And recently I read this idea that with social media, where we live in this world of personas, of people that are constantly trying to project the image. This, I'm sure, was happening before social media, but now it's really, maybe it's exploded in some ways. That we live in a world of personas, but we're trying to constantly give the image that we're stable, we have it together, and we're unafraid, and that everybody's walking around trying to do this, but not recognizing that actually all of us have some of this suffering inside. All of us. In fact, we might say this is what the Buddha was pointing to with the first noble truth, that there is suffering, is some of this difficulty that humans experience, and we're trying to hide from this difficulty, both from others, give this impression that we have it together, and to hide it from ourselves. We don't want to be with these things. Of course we don't want to. It's uncomfortable. Another reason why it's difficult maybe to just allow emotions is that we have some beliefs about them. We have beliefs that, well, only certain genders express certain emotions, and only at certain times or in certain settings or something like this, or just this general idea of, I shouldn't feel this. This shouldn't be happening. And so often we have beliefs, that come from our culture, from the generation we grew up in, families, of course. Some people have this idea that, every emotion must be shared with everybody else, and they're like talking all about it, all their inner life, and other people have the opposite trait, that they're not going to share anything. But what are some of our beliefs that we have about emotions, like the role that they have in our lives or the value that they have? And we might explore this for ourselves, just to ask, what are our beliefs about this emotion? Or what scares me about this emotion? Or what if I could fully feel this emotion, what would happen? And the physiologists tell us that emotions last for about 90 seconds if we don't get tangled up with them, with stories, or if we're not fueling them with these kind of resistance, like this shouldn't be here, and this means I'm a bad person, or something like this, and I don't want to be a bad person, I shouldn't feel this, and the last time I did, this happened. And I can say in my experience, this is true actually. I have had this experience on retreat when the mind is a little bit more quiet and settled, of having this really intense sadness. I couldn't even tell you why. It's oh my gosh, it was so intense, and the tears started, and wow, I'm okay, I'm just gonna be with this. Wow, it was intense. About 90 seconds later, it was gone. It's wow, that was amazing. I'd never experienced anything like that. I'd heard these ideas that, emotions can be short-lived, but we only prolong them with our stories. But it wasn't until I actually experienced that. And I had this idea, was that what I was afraid of? That wasn't so bad. 90 seconds, I can handle this. So kind of gave me some confidence, and kind of also shifted my experience with emotions. So we might have some resistance, we might have some of these beliefs about them, but this idea of our emotional life can just be folded into part of our practice. Instead of something that gets in the way of our practice, or this feeling of, well, I'll meditate when I'm feeling a little bit more stable, or when I have this emotional thing taken care of, or whatever it might be. This idea of RAFT, recognize, allow, feel in the body. Feel in the body so we can get out of the thoughts. And then to tease apart the reactions. Most often our reaction is resistance. And so part of our practice is maybe just to notice, acknowledge, and experience the emotion to the best of our ability. And this, we should not underestimate how powerful this is. Just how our life unfolds differently if we don't have this feeling that we have to avoid certain emotions. If we don't have to avoid certain situations because they might create the conditions in which emotions might arise. So this idea of, instead of avoiding or distracting or circling around the hole, maybe there's a way in which there can be more like of a enter here kind of way of enter here into the meditation hall, so to speak, or enter here as a way of our practice. Like our emotional life is a place in which we don't have to run away from. Of course, we have to use wisdom here too. It's not helpful to jump into emotion in a way that's going to cause overwhelm. So, because when we're overwhelmed, we are overwhelmed. We don't have access to our wisdom and support and resources. So, and we also need to take care of our trauma history. Sometimes that can really tip us over into overwhelm, kind of rather easily. But our mindfulness practice, our practice towards greater awakening, needs to include our emotional life, not because it's, once we have that all cleaned up, we're going to become awakened, but because that most often is what can be a roadblock to greater peace and freedom and ease. So as a way to help work with some of the difficulties in our lives. So our mindfulness practice can, of course, include our emotions. Recognize, allow, feel in the body, tease apart. And as our practice evolves, our experience with emotions evolve. In the beginning, we often have like these interpretations or narratives about emotions. We have stories about them and we talk about them, and we might feel like, okay, this is an authentic way for me to be with our emotions, but there's a way also in which we do that which we're not actually experiencing or feeling them. We're just talking about them. So it's different. Maybe that is kind of like the recognizing part of this. And then further along with practice, then we actually feel them. We feel the heartbreak. We feel the sadness. The tears come. We feel the anger, the heat of the anger. And we also feel the resistance. We feel that to notice our way we want to distract ourselves from that and not be with this. And then with further with practice, then the resistance patterns start dissolving. We start to see how just in all areas of our life, it doesn't serve us to be disconnected from ourselves and to be trying to isolate ourselves from everything that's uncomfortable. We recognize it's not possible to do that, and it's not the end of the world if we're uncomfortable. And then we start to realize that the direct experience of emotion without any resistance, just like sheer emotion, is perfectly fine. It arises, we experience it, and it passes away. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that. But it's a journey to get to recognize to actually feel, to be okay, to allow them, and just to have this be part of our experience. And then maybe I'll end with an excerpt from a poem from Jeff Foster. And this poem is called How I Became a Warrior. Once I ran from fear, so fear controlled me, until I learned to hold fear like a newborn. Listen to it, but not give in. Honor it, but not worship it. Fear cannot stop me anymore. I walked with courage into the storm. I still have fear, but it does not have me. And then he continues with a bunch of other emotions. I'm not going to read them all here. And then the ending of the poem goes, Once I ran from difficult feelings. Now they are my advisors, confidants, friends, and they all have a home in me. And they all belong and have dignity. I am sensitive, soft, fragile, my arms wrapped around all my inner children, and in my sensitivity, power. In my fragility, an unshakable presence. In the depths of my wounds, in what I had named darkness, I found a blazing light that guides me now in battle. I became a warrior when I turned towards myself and started listening. Jeff Foster, How I Became a Warrior. So this idea of our emotions are, even though in the kind of like the Buddhist scene, we don't talk about them necessarily that much, and they're not an integral part of the Buddhist teachings, but they're an integral part of our life. And we can welcome them into our lives, and we can work with them and not avoid them. So I think with that, I'll open it up if there are some questions, including if there's some questions on YouTube. I don't know if anybody does or will, but
Hi, thank you, Diana, again. Well, with the RAFT practice, I find that knowing that I have to recognize it, I don't want to allow it to be there. And so I just feel unwilling, because then I know I'm like, oh gosh, here we go again. But then I know it's the stories that I tell myself, and so rather than what in your last poem, what Foster had put, like, there are all my previous experiences can help guide me. I'm like, I don't want to do that again because it sucks. And so when I'm trying to meditate, I kind of just, I put the timer on and I try to go with it and see what arises, but I'm just busy thinking, and I know that with this practice, there is more awareness, but it's just hard to deal with it because I don't. Sometimes I feel like, because I don't want to.
I don't blame you.
Thank
Right,
you.
right? It's hard. This is hard. And I'm making it sound like, oh, okay, just do RAFT, you'll be fine. It's not like that, right? This life is messy and complicated and all these types of things. And there might be some real wisdom to recognize, say, okay, there's that sadness, and you know what? I'm going to deal with you later. Right now I'm meditating. And maybe can be, just say, later. Or anger or something, and just say it later. So just recognize it and not just like allow ourselves to just fall into it. Just say, okay, I see that it's here, but right now I'm not going to do this. So there might be some wisdom into doing this. And what happens is we kind of like gain some confidence or gain some experiences where we are not being pushed around as much, then it becomes easier. And I recently read this description. Thank you for saying this. I wanted to bring this in the talk. That this idea that when we really don't want something, or let's say this, there's this expression, what we resist persists. You might have heard of this. But I've heard of this other way. It's like, so we have an emotion, and we have maybe this reaction to the emotion. And if the reaction is, well, we really don't want it, then what happens is the emotion kind of like they end up leaning against each other, and so they get stronger and stronger. But then if the resistance were to go away, then the emotion just kind of falls away. So the more we're resisting, the stronger the emotions are. But we can't see that. Like we don't, right now, these are just words that I'm saying. But as we start to have more experience, as we start to, I'll just say this, have more experience with our practice, and then the resistance just starts to soften a little bit, and then the intensity of the emotions softens as well. They go down together. They're intricately related. So, and you're doing the right thing. I appreciate very much that you said, oh no, I don't want to feel this. And then you said, and I know those are the stories. Perfect. That's where we start. Like, okay, I'm all tangled up here. I have all these stories going with it and I don't want it. Perfect. And then it's perfectly fine too to say, okay, I'm all tangled up. I'm going to put this aside right now. We don't have to jump right in. I don't know is this helpful, Anne-Rose?
Yes, very much. That is what's been happening. I just resist and it persists. And that's because I allow it to persist rather than just tease it apart or feel what it's like in the body instead of identifying with it like, oh, so now this is what I'm, and it doesn't have to be like that. So maybe being honest with myself too. So thank you.
You're welcome. It turns out honesty is not a bad thing. Is there one that...
So, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So, Jamie has a question. Okay, I need to scroll a little bit. I find that my mind tends to jump from recognize to feel. Since I feel emotions mostly as tension, but then I have aversion to the tension.
What was that last word? I have what?
Aversion to the
yeah.
tension. Do I need to slow down and go through accept first before feel?
I often think about, maybe I should talk this way. I often think about feeling as a way to help us allow. So accept is a little bit different than allow. And I would say like allow is like, okay, it is there. Can we not push it away? And to feel it in the body is one way that helps us to allow it, because we are, if we're in the body, then we're less in our heads. And the heads is where we have the story about this shouldn't be here. I don't want to be here. Oh no, here I go. I'm always going to be like this, or whatever we might have. So you don't necessarily have to slow down, because RAFT doesn't have to be in that order, but you might feel the tension. I guess maybe you are feeling the tension, right, if you're saying this. So the emotion might become, the aversion might become the next emotion. So then you recognize that and feel the aversion, and then there might be aversion to aversion, and then to recognize that aversion, and then just to recognize, oh, okay, there's some resistance here. Is there something that can soften? And it might be, sometimes softening in the body can help too, which can soften what's going on in the mind and the whole experience. Sometimes just a deep exhale or something like this might help. So I hope that was clear enough. Okay, so here we are at the top of the hour. Thank you for your attention, and I'm wishing you all a wonderful rest of the evening. Thank you.